I'm 11 years old. I'm also the only combat pilot on this plane. And in 3 minutes, everyone here dies unless you let me fly. The flight attendant stared at the tiny girl in the purple hoodie standing in the aisle while 256 passengers screamed around them, death approaching at supersonic speed. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Maya Chen sat in seat 9B with her purple hoodie pulled up over her long black braids, her small frame curled against the window as United Airlines Flight 738 hummed through the darkness 6 hours into its journey from San Diego to Tokyo. The cartoon character on her hoodie, some bright-eyed anime girl with improbable hair, caught the overhead reading light as she shifted in her sleep. At 4'8" and 72 pounds, she looked like what she was supposed to be, an 11-year-old girl traveling alone across the Pacific Ocean, an unaccompanied minor with a lanyard around her neck and paperwork in the seat pocket that identified her as someone's responsibility. The flight attendant had checked on her twice already. Once during boarding, crouching down with that special smile adults reserve for children traveling alone, asking if Maya needed anything, if she was nervous about the long flight, if she wanted some apple juice or maybe a cookie. The second time came an hour after takeoff, when the attendant brought coloring books and crayons without being asked, the kind gesture of someone who saw a small child and wanted to make the journey easier. Maya had accepted them with a quiet thank you and a smile that belonged to a shy 6th grader, then tucked them into the seat pocket without opening them. She didn't need coloring books. She needed sleep. Real sleep. The kind that didn't come often anymore. The businessman in 9A had glanced at her briefly during boarding, noted her age with the dismissive awareness of someone mentally cataloging his seatmates, then buried himself in his laptop before the aircraft even pushed back from the gate. He was working on spreadsheets, fingers flying across the keyboard with the urgency of someone who believed his quarterly reports mattered more than anything else in the world. He hadn't spoken to Maya beyond a polite nod. To him, she was invisible, just a kid taking up space, probably flying to visit relatives, probably scared of the long flight over the ocean, probably not worth acknowledging beyond basic courtesy. The elderly Japanese woman in 9C had been kinder. She'd offered Maya a wrapped candy during boarding, her weathered hands pressing it into Maya's palm with the gentle insistence of someone who'd raised children and knew that small kindnesses mattered. For later, she'd said in accented English, her smile creating deep lines around her eyes. Long flight. You get hungry. Maya had thanked her and pocketed the candy, recognizing in the woman's face the universal grandmother expression, the one that saw all children as precious and fragile, the one that wanted to protect and comfort, the one that assumed Maya was probably missing her own grandmother right now. The woman had patted Maya's hand and settled into her seat with a satisfied nod, confident she'd done her small part to make one child's journey a little easier. Nobody on Flight 738 knew the truth. Nobody knew that 48 hours ago, Maya had been in the cockpit of a modified F-16 trainer over the Nevada desert, executing combat maneuvers at Mach 1.4 while 3 other aircraft tried to achieve radar lock on her position. Nobody knew that her call sign wasn't just a nickname but an official military designation earned through performance that made veteran pilots shake their heads in disbelief. Nobody knew that Phoenix, the name whispered in classified briefing rooms and sealed training reports, belonged to the tiny girl in the purple hoodie who looked like she should be worried about math homework and which boy in her class liked her. Nobody knew about Project Nightingale. The program had started 17 years ago with a simple question posed by a neurological research team working with the Department of Defense: what if we could identify children with extraordinary spatial reasoning, reflexes, and decision-making capabilities at very young ages, before socialization taught them to doubt their instincts, before fear became learned behavior, before the brain lost its maximum plasticity? What if we could train them the way Olympic gymnasts are trained, the way chess prodigies are developed, except instead of sports or games, we train them for aerial combat? Not as soldiers, children couldn't be soldiers, the ethical frameworks were clear on that, but as specialists. Emergency assets. The impossible solution to impossible problems. The debate had been fierce and mostly classified. Critics called it child exploitation, a violation of international law, a dystopian nightmare that turned kids into weapons. Supporters argued it was no different than training child prodigies in music or mathematics, that some minds were simply built for specific tasks, that refusing to develop extraordinary talent because of arbitrary age restrictions was itself a form of negligence. The compromise had been strict: voluntary participation with parental consent, rigorous psychological monitoring, academic education maintained alongside training, and absolute secrecy to protect the children from public scrutiny and foreign intelligence agencies. The children would train but never deploy in actual combat. They were theoretical assets, insurance policies, the answer to scenarios that should never happen. Maya had been 6 years old when the testing team came to her school. She'd been in first grade, already reading at a high school level, already showing signs of the spatial reasoning that made geometry intuitive and three-dimensional chess easy. The tests had seemed like games, puzzles to solve, patterns to recognize, questions about how she would move through imaginary spaces. She'd excelled without trying. 2 weeks later, men and women in civilian clothes had met with her parents for 6 hours. The conversation had been careful, layered with implications and consequences. Your daughter is extraordinary. Her mind works in ways we rarely see. We'd like to offer her specialized training. She would still go to school, still have friends, still have a childhood. But she would also learn things that most adults never learn. She would develop capabilities that could save lives someday. It would be difficult. It would be demanding. It would change her life forever. Her parents had been immigrant engineers from Taiwan, people who understood sacrifice and discipline, who'd built their lives through relentless work and delayed gratification. They'd asked the hard questions: would Maya be safe? Would she be happy? Could she quit if she wanted? The answers had satisfied them enough to sign papers that would remain classified for 50 years. At 6 years old, Maya had become the youngest recruit in Project Nightingale's 3rd class. The training had started gently: flight simulators disguised as video games, physical conditioning framed as fun activities, academic acceleration that felt natural for a child who devoured learning like other kids devoured candy. But by age 7, Maya was in real cockpits. By age 8, she was flying solo in modified trainers designed for her size and strength. By age 9, she'd earned her call sign during a training exercise that pitted her against 2 adult pilots in a simulated dogfight. She'd outmaneuvered both, executing a vertical spiral that made the observers gasp, then positioned herself on both their 6 o'clocks in a sequence so perfect that the simulation lead had actually stopped the exercise to verify the telemetry was real. Phoenix, he'd said after reviewing the data for the 3rd time. She rose up through both of them and came down behind like a bird of prey. Phoenix. That's her call sign. 412 combat hours later, Maya had logged more actual flight time than many commercial pilots twice her age. Not simulated hours, real hours in real aircraft, most of them during classified exercises that tested Project Nightingale's capabilities under controlled conditions. 17 times she'd flown in live-fire scenarios where the missiles were real and the consequences of failure meant actual death, though always with safety protocols and backup pilots ready to take control. She'd engaged hostile drones, flown defensive patterns against simulated enemy aircraft, executed combat landings that would make experienced pilots nervous. She'd done all of this while still going to school, still having friends who thought she just traveled a lot for some government program, still looking like a normal kid when she wanted to. Right now, curled up in seat 9B with her neck pillow crooked and her hoodie sleeve covering half her face, she looked like nothing more than a tired 11-year-old who'd fallen asleep before the in-flight movie started. The businessman in 9A had glanced at her once more when she shifted in her sleep, noted that she was still just a kid sleeping, then returned to his spreadsheets. The elderly woman in 9C had smiled at Maya's peaceful face and thought about her own granddaughter back in Osaka, probably sleeping in her own bed right now, safe and innocent and unburdened by anything more serious than school exams. If they could have seen Maya's dreams, they might have thought differently. In her sleep, Maya was flying. Not the gentle cruising of a commercial 777 but the violent ballet of combat aviation, rolling inverted at 400 knots, pulling 7 gs in a ascending spiral, tracking targets while her own aircraft shuddered under missile lock warnings. In her dreams, she was Phoenix, and Phoenix didn't sleep peacefully. Phoenix dreamed in tactical scenarios and threat assessments and the mathematics of survival at supersonic speeds. The Boeing 777 hummed through the night at 42,000 feet, its twin engines pulling 256 passengers and crew across the Pacific Ocean at 560 miles per hour. In the cockpit, Captain Richard Torres and First Officer Amanda Chen, no relation to Maya, monitored their instruments with the relaxed attention of experienced pilots on a routine flight. They'd flown this route dozens of times. San Diego to Tokyo, 11 hours gate to gate, usually uneventful except for occasional turbulence and the routine communications with air traffic control as they passed through different flight information regions. Torres was 53, a former Navy pilot who transitioned to commercial aviation after 20 years of military service. Chen was 37, a rising star in United's pilot ranks with a reputation for precision and calm under pressure. Together they'd logged over 40,000 flight hours. They knew their aircraft, knew their route, knew that the Pacific Ocean crossing was one of the safest parts of any flight plan. At 6 hours and 42 minutes into the flight, everything changed. The first indication came from the Traffic Collision Avoidance System, CAS, the automated system that monitors airspace around the aircraft and warns of potential collisions. A single warning tone, then another, then suddenly the system was lighting up with alerts that made both pilots sit straighter in their seats. Multiple targets, Chen said, her voice tight. Fast moving. Very fast. Torres leaned forward, studying the display with growing concern. 6 contacts, all converging on their position from different vectors, all moving at speeds that commercial aircraft couldn't achieve. His hand moved to the radio before his conscious mind fully processed what he was seeing. Tokyo Control, United 738. We're showing multiple high-speed contacts converging on our position. Can you confirm traffic? The response came back puzzled. United 738, we show no traffic in your vicinity. Your transponder shows you clear by at least 50 miles in all directions. But the TCAS didn't lie. Torres switched to the military emergency frequency, his training from decades ago suddenly relevant again. Any station, this is United Airlines Flight 738, civilian Boeing 777 at 42,000 feet over the Pacific. We have multiple high-speed contacts converging on our position. They're not showing on civilian radar. Request immediate assistance. The response came in seconds, and the voice carried an urgency that made Torres's blood run cold. United 738, this is U.S. Pacific Command. We have you on radar. We also have 6 unmanned combat aerial vehicles closing on your position at high speed. They appear to be attack drones. Unknown origin. Their flight profiles indicate hostile intent. Torres felt his hands go numb. In 30 years of flying, including combat missions in the Gulf War, he'd never heard those particular words directed at him while commanding a civilian passenger flight. Hostile intent. Attack drones. These weren't navigational hazards or communications errors. This was warfare, happening to his aircraft, with 256 innocent people on board. Pacific Command, what are our options? We're scrambling F-35s from Carrier Strike Group 5. They'll be in your area in 18 minutes. But sir, those drones will be in firing position in approximately 5 minutes. You need to take evasive action immediately. Torres stared at his instruments as if they could provide an answer that his training hadn't prepared him for. Evasive action. Combat maneuvers. In a 560,000-pound commercial aircraft full of civilians at 42,000 feet over open ocean. He was a commercial pilot. He flew passengers in straight lines from point A to point B. He avoided weather and optimized fuel consumption and made smooth turns that didn't spill coffee. He didn't dogfight. Pacific Command, I'm a commercial pilot. I don't know how to fight drones. I don't know combat maneuvers in an aircraft this size. I just fly passengers. Silence on the radio for 3 seconds that felt like hours. Then the voice came back, and Torres could hear the barely controlled desperation beneath its professional tone. Captain, we need you to find someone who does. Do you have any military pilots on board? Anyone with combat experience? Anyone who knows defensive flying? Torres's mind raced through procedures that didn't exist. Passenger manifests didn't list military experience. He had no way of knowing if any of his 254 passengers had ever flown anything more aggressive than a Cessna on a calm day. But he had to try. He had to ask. Because in 4 minutes, if he did nothing, everyone on his aircraft would die. He reached for the PA system with a hand that shook despite 30 years of trained composure. His finger pressed the button. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of impending death. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I need everyone to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. In the cabin, 254 passengers looked up from books and movies and sleep, sensing something wrong in the captain's tone. We are currently under attack by hostile military drones. They will be in firing position in approximately 4 minutes. I am a commercial pilot and I do not have the training to defend this aircraft in combat. I need any military pilot with combat flying experience to come to the cockpit immediately. Anyone who has flown defensively in combat situations. Please, if there is anyone on board with these skills, I need you in the cockpit right now. We have 42 children on this flight. Please. The last word broke slightly. Torres released the PA button and closed his eyes for just a second, offering a prayer to a God he'd stopped believing in after seeing what he'd seen in the Gulf War but who suddenly seemed worth invoking when children's lives hung in balance. In the cabin, chaos erupted like a dam breaking. Screaming. Crying. Parents grabbing children and pulling them close. A woman in first class fainted, slumping against her husband who was too shocked to catch her properly. A man in business class started hyperventilating into an airsickness bag. 3 different people tried to use their cell phones despite being over the Pacific Ocean with no signal, the useless gesture of people who needed to do something, anything, even if it made no sense. A teenage boy started live streaming on his phone, talking frantically into the camera about being attacked, about dying, about wanting his mom to know he loved her. A priest in economy began praying loudly in Latin, his voice rising above the screams. The flight attendants moved through the aisles trying to maintain calm, but their own faces betrayed their terror. They'd been trained for medical emergencies, for unruly passengers, for mechanical failures and emergency landings. Nobody had trained them for aerial combat. Nobody had trained them to keep people calm when death approached at hypersonic speeds. In seat 9B, Maya's eyes opened. She lay completely still for 3 seconds, her mind processing the captain's words with the systematic analysis that 6 years of training had made automatic. Hostile drones. Combat situation. 4 minutes to firing position. Commercial aircraft with 256 souls aboard including 42 children under 12, she'd counted them during boarding because that's what Phoenix did, tactical assessment was as natural as breathing. Around her, the cabin descended into pandemonium. The elderly Japanese woman in 9C was praying in her native language, tears streaming down her weathered face, her hands clutching the wrapped candy she'd meant to give her granddaughter in Tokyo. The businessman in 9A was trying to call his wife, his hands shaking so badly he dropped his phone twice, his spreadsheets forgotten on his laptop screen as if quarterly reports had ever mattered when measured against mortality. Maya unbuckled her seatbelt with the precise click of someone who'd done it thousands of times in far more turbulent situations. She stood up in the aisle, her 4'8" frame barely visible above the seat backs, her purple hoodie with its cartoon character making her look even younger than 11. She looked like a child standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, a confused little girl who didn't understand what was happening, who should sit down and let the adults handle things. She began walking toward the cockpit. Adults rushed past her in the aisle, some heading toward the lavatories as if hiding in a bathroom would save them from missiles, others clustering near emergency exits as if there were anywhere to go at 42,000 feet over open ocean. Nobody saw her. Or if they saw her, they saw only what they expected to see, a scared child moving through chaos, probably looking for a parent or a flight attendant, probably about to start crying. A flight attendant nearly tripped over her as the woman rushed toward business class to handle a medical emergency. The attendant looked down, registered a child in her path, started to automatically redirect her. Maya reached up and tugged the flight attendant's sleeve with firm, controlled pressure. Not the desperate grab of a frightened child but the authoritative touch of someone who needed attention and knew how to get it. "Ma'am, I need to speak with the captain immediately." The flight attendant looked down at Maya's face, saw an 11-year-old girl in a cartoon hoodie, and her expression crumpled with anguish. Here was a child, small and young and innocent, standing in an aircraft about to be blown out of the sky, asking to speak with the captain as if that could somehow help. The attendant's voice came out strangled, trying to maintain professionalism while her own terror screamed beneath every word. "Sweetie, you need to go back to your seat and buckle up. Put your head down. Everything is going to be. Ma'am." Maya's voice cut through with a precision that didn't match her appearance. Clear. Controlled. Military. "I'm a military pilot. Authorization code November India Golf Hotel Tango India November Golf Alpha Lima Echo. Project Nightingale. I'm the combat pilot the captain is asking for." The flight attendant stared at Maya as if the child had suddenly started speaking in ancient Sumerian. The words made no sense. This was an 11-year-old girl in a purple hoodie with cartoon characters on it. Children weren't military pilots. Children didn't have authorization codes. Children didn't use words like combat pilot with that particular cadence that suggested they actually understood what those words meant in practice rather than theory. "You're a child," the attendant said, the words coming out automatic, stating the obvious because her brain couldn't process what her ears had just heard. Maya's expression didn't change. Her voice remained perfectly level, but there was something in her eyes now, something ancient and cold and absolutely certain, that didn't belong in an 11-year-old's face. Something that had seen death and dealt it and understood the mathematics of survival at speeds where hesitation measured in milliseconds meant the difference between living and dying. "Ma'am, in approximately 3 minutes and 40 seconds those drones will achieve optimal firing position. In 4 minutes and 10 seconds, everyone on this aircraft dies." The captain asked for a military pilot with combat experience. "I have 412 combat hours including 17 live hostile engagements. I've flown defensively against drone swarms in 6 separate scenarios. I've logged more combat time than most pilots in the Air Force. My training is classified at the highest levels for operational security reasons, but Pacific Command can verify my credentials. But we don't have time for verification. We have 3 minutes and 35 seconds. Please let me through." The flight attendant's mouth opened and closed twice without sound. Everything about this situation violated reality as she understood it. But there was something in the way this tiny girl stood, perfect military posture, weight balanced, breathing controlled, that made the attendant's training kick in. In emergencies, you followed procedures. And when procedures didn't exist, you made decisions based on the information you had. The information she had was that a child who spoke like a veteran pilot was asking for access to the cockpit while death approached at hypersonic speeds. The captain had asked for someone with combat experience. Maybe the universe was insane enough that this child was that someone. Maybe desperation made you believe impossible things. Maybe it didn't matter because in 3 minutes they'd all be dead anyway, so what harm could letting one small child into the cockpit possibly do? "Follow me." They pushed through the chaos of screaming passengers. A woman grabbed at the flight attendant, crying about her babies in economy, begging for someone to save her babies. A man shouted that they should rush the cockpit and take control, as if civilian passengers could somehow fly combat maneuvers through force of will. Several people saw the flight attendant escorting a small child toward the front of the aircraft and shouted in confusion and anger. "What are you doing with that child? Leave her alone. She should be with her parents." None of them understood. None of them could understand. The flight attendant herself didn't understand. She just knew that the captain had asked for help and this child claimed to be that help, and there were no other options presenting themselves in the 3 minutes they had left to live. The cockpit door opened. Captain Torres turned, his face haggard with stress and fear and the knowledge that he was about to watch everyone under his care die. He saw the flight attendant. He saw an 11-year-old girl in a purple hoodie standing next to her. His expression collapsed into something between rage and despair. "What? No. We don't have time for." Maya's voice cut through his protest with the sharp precision of a blade through cloth. She didn't raise her volume, but somehow her words carried absolute authority despite coming from a child who weighed 72 pounds and whose braids made her look like she should be in a school cafeteria rather than a cockpit under attack. "Captain Torres, I'm Lieutenant Maya Chen, call sign Phoenix, Project Nightingale. I've logged 412 combat hours including defensive flying against drone swarms in both training and live-fire exercises. You can check with Pacific Command, they'll confirm my credentials. But we don't have time for confirmation. Those drones will fire in 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Sir, I need you to give me control of this aircraft right now." First Officer Chen spun around in her seat, staring at this impossible child with an expression of absolute disbelief. "She's 11 years old. She's also the only combat pilot on this aircraft," Captain Torres said, the words coming out hollow as he stared at his radar screen where 6 death machines were converging on his position with the inexorable certainty of physics and murder. His hand moved to the radio, keying the military frequency with movements that felt mechanical, disconnected. "Pacific Command, we have someone claiming to be Phoenix from Project Nightingale. Can you confirm?" The response didn't come immediately. 3 seconds of silence that felt like drowning. Then a different voice came over the radio, older, female, carrying the weight of stars on her shoulders and decisions that sent people to die. "Phoenix. Dear God, she's on that flight." Captain Torres felt his reality shift. That response, that immediate recognition, that tone of shock mixed with something that might have been hope, told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't a delusion. This wasn't a child playing pretend. This was something real that he didn't understand but that the military clearly did. The voice continued, now speaking with urgent authority. "Captain, that's one of our most skilled pilots regardless of age. If Phoenix says she can save your aircraft, you should believe her. We'll confirm credentials through proper channels, but you don't have time to wait. Give her the controls." "That's not a suggestion, Captain. That's an order from someone with enough rank to make it stick." Torres looked at Maya. Really looked at her for the first time. This tiny girl who should be in 6th grade learning fractions and worrying about which boy liked her and maybe stressing about the school dance. This child whose purple hoodie had a cheerful cartoon character smiling from the fabric. This 11-year-old who was staring at his instruments with eyes that were analyzing and calculating and seeing things he couldn't see. "What do I do?" His voice came out broken, a pilot with 30 years of experience asking an 11-year-old child for instructions because the universe had become incomprehensible but death remained perfectly comprehensible. Maya moved to the observer seat behind the captain's position, her small frame making the movement look almost comical, a child playing pretend in a cockpit. Except there was nothing playful in how she adjusted the seat, pulling it all the way forward so her feet could reach the rudder pedals, lowering the headrest, her hands finding the secondary controls with muscle memory that didn't match her age or size. "Sir, I'm taking tactical control. Keep your hands near the yoke in case I need you for something." "First Officer Chen, I'll need you to manage throttle on my command. I can't reach both controls and fly simultaneously in this cockpit configuration. This is going to feel very wrong. Commercial pilots don't fly like this. Commercial aircraft aren't supposed to move like this. But I promise you, I've done this 17 times before in similar scenarios. Sir, I need you to trust me. Torres felt his hands grip the armrests of his seat. How can I trust? Captain. Maya's voice was gentle now, almost kind, as if she understood his crisis and wanted to ease it. You asked for a military pilot with combat experience. Pacific Command confirmed my credentials. I'm here. I'm qualified. And we have 2 minutes and 40 seconds before those drones fire. You can trust me or you can watch everyone on this aircraft die. Those are your 2 options. Which would you prefer? Captain Richard Torres had flown combat missions in the Gulf War. He'd survived situations where enemy fire had torn through his aircraft's wing. He'd landed damaged planes on carrier decks in storms. He'd seen death and dealt it and understood that war was chaos barely controlled by training and discipline. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the surreal nightmare of handing control of his aircraft to an 11-year-old child while hostile missiles approached at Mach 2. Aircraft is yours, Phoenix. The drones fired. 6 missiles launched simultaneously from 6 different vectors, their targeting systems locked on the thermal signature of the 777's engines and the massive radar return of its fuselage. Fire and forget weapons, each one carrying a warhead designed to destroy military aircraft with hardened systems and defensive countermeasures. Against a civilian airliner, any one of them would be instantly fatal. 6 of them meant absolute certainty of total destruction. Maya's hands moved on the controls. What happened next would be analyzed in flight simulators and military academies for years afterward. Engineers would study the telemetry and shake their heads in disbelief. Pilots would watch the recreation and insist it was impossible. But 256 people were alive to tell the story, so it couldn't be impossible. It could only be Phoenix. The massive Boeing 777 banked hard to the left, the maneuver beginning with a violence that commercial aircraft never experienced outside of catastrophic failure. But this wasn't failure. This was intentional. Controlled. The bank angle hit 45 degrees, beyond the normal operational envelope for commercial flight, and kept increasing. Passengers screamed as gravity shifted and the cabin tilted, overhead bins shaking, loose items starting to slide. The elderly Japanese woman in 9C grabbed her armrests with white-knuckled hands, praying faster. The businessman in 9A vomited into his airsickness bag as G-forces increased beyond what his body had ever experienced. In the cockpit, Captain Torres watched his artificial horizon spin and felt his stomach drop as the aircraft executed a maneuver that violated every commercial aviation protocol he'd ever learned. First Officer Chen had one hand on the throttle as instructed, the other bracing against her seat as the aircraft rolled through 90 degrees, inverted now, the Pacific Ocean appearing above them through the windscreen in a perspective that human beings were never meant to experience at 42,000 feet. Maya's voice remained perfectly calm. Throttle to 90%. Maintain. Chen adjusted thrust with shaking hands, her training taking over despite her conscious mind screaming that this was insane. The aircraft was inverted. They were flying upside down. Commercial aircraft didn't fly upside down. The wings weren't designed for inverted flight. The engines would starve. The structure would fail. Except none of that was happening because somehow this child knew exactly how to balance the forces, how to maintain airspeed and altitude while executing a defensive barrel roll that would make fighter pilots envious. The first 3 missiles lost their lock. Their targeting systems, designed to track aircraft flying in normal flight regimes, couldn't compensate for the radical change in the 777's radar and thermal signature. They streaked past harmlessly, one of them missing the aircraft's inverted tail by less than 200 feet before their safety systems detonated them at a safe distance. 3 missiles remained, their more sophisticated guidance systems adapting to the unexpected maneuver. They tracked the 777 as Maya completed the barrel roll and leveled off, except she didn't level off in the same direction they'd been flying. She'd rotated the aircraft 180 degrees during the roll, now flying back toward the drone formation at a slight descent angle, trading altitude for airspeed. Throttle to max. All engines. Chen pushed the throttles forward. The twin GE90 engines spooled up to maximum thrust, their combined 220,000 pounds of force accelerating the massive aircraft in a direction that commercial flights never accelerated, toward threats rather than away from them. Captain Torres found his voice. "Phoenix, you're flying toward the drones." "Yes, sir. Their missiles are tracking our thermal signature. At this range and closure rate, they can't adjust fast enough for a head-on pass. We'll be past them in 8 seconds. Except 8 seconds was an eternity when death approached from multiple vectors. The 3 remaining missiles adjusted their trajectory, their guidance systems calculating intercept solutions with the cold mathematics of machines designed for murder. But Maya had already calculated one step further. As the missiles closed to optimal detonation range, she did something that commercial aircraft never did and that fighter jets rarely attempted. She deployed the flaps asymmetrically. The left wing's flaps extended to 20 degrees. The right wing's flaps remained retracted. The resulting asymmetric drag created a massive yaw motion, the aircraft's nose swinging hard to the right while the fuselage maintained forward momentum, creating a brief moment where the aircraft essentially flew sideways, presenting the smallest possible radar cross-section to the incoming missiles. The missile's targeting systems, confused by the sudden change in the radar return and the altered thermal signature as the engine's exhaust was momentarily blocked by the fuselage, lost their lock for crucial fractions of a second. That fraction was enough. The missile streaked past, one of them so close that its proximity fuse nearly detonated, but nearly was the difference between 256 people living and dying. Maya retracted the asymmetric flaps and rolled the aircraft level, her small hands moving with practiced efficiency that looked impossible but was simply the result of thousands of hours of training that had started when she was 6 years old. Her breathing was elevated now, not panicked but definitely working harder, the adrenaline catching up with the cognitive load of flying combat maneuvers in an aircraft that weighed as much as a small building. Over the radio, a new voice crackled with urgency and something that might have been awe. "United 738, this is Viper Lead. We're entering the combat area now. Kid, whoever you are, that was the most beautiful defensive flying I've ever seen from a commercial aircraft. We're engaging the drones now." Maya's voice remained steady despite her elevated breathing. "Viper Lead, this is Phoenix. Clear my 6 o'clock. I've got 3 birds still tracking." There was a pause on the radio. A long pause. Then the voice came back, but the tone had changed completely. The casual respect of one pilot addressing another had transformed into something deeper. Recognition. Understanding. An absolute shock. "Phoenix. Project Nightingale Phoenix." Holy, the pilot caught himself, remembering he was on an open channel with civilian aircraft. "Ma'am, it's an honor." "Viper Flight, you heard Phoenix. Let's clear her 6. These drones just tried to kill a legend." The F-35 swept through the combat area like avenging angels, their stealth profiles making them invisible until they were already firing. Advanced air-to-air missiles launched from internal weapons bays, tracking the drones with targeting systems that were generations ahead of whatever technology the drones possessed. For drones died in as many seconds, explosions blooming in the night sky visible through the 777's windows, making passengers scream in terror because they saw only explosions and thought they were dying until they realized the explosions were distant, were enemies dying instead of them. The remaining 2 drones attempted to escape, their programming recognizing they were outmatched, breaking off from the 777 and diving toward the ocean surface where the curvature of the Earth and the radar clutter from waves might give them a chance at survival. The F-35s hunted them down with predatory efficiency, missiles finding targets, more explosions, and then silence except for the steady hum of the 777's engines. Maya's hands on the controls were trembling now, fine tremors that came from adrenaline dump and sustained G-forces and the physical strain of flying combat maneuvers in an aircraft that required more strength than her 11-year-old body possessed. She took a deep breath, let it out slowly, the technique they'd taught her at age 7 for managing post-combat stress responses. Captain Torres, aircraft is yours. Threat neutralized. Resume normal flight to Tokyo. You might want to make an announcement to the passengers. They're probably terrified. Captain Torres took control of his aircraft with hands that shook worse than Maya's. He stared at the instruments, at the altitude that was 5,000 feet lower than it should be, at the airspeed that was 50 knots faster than cruise, at the fuel consumption that showed they'd burned enough for an extra hour of flight during maneuvers that had lasted less than 3 minutes. He looked at Maya. This tiny child with braids and a purple hoodie who was breathing hard and whose hands trembled but whose eyes remained perfectly clear and focused. Who are you? The question came out as a whisper. Maya unbuckled from the observer seat and stood, her small frame barely visible behind the pilot's seats. She looked exhausted now, the adrenaline fading and leaving behind the physical reality that she'd just pulled G-forces that her developing body wasn't really designed to handle repeatedly. Someone who's been training for this since I was 6 years old, sir. Someone who gave up normal childhood so that when the impossible happens, I can do the impossible. She paused, then added quietly, I'd like to go back to my seat now, if that's okay. And maybe some apple juice. I'm really thirsty. First Officer Chen was crying. She tried to hide it, turning her face away, but her shoulders shook and tears ran down her face because the cognitive dissonance was too much. A child had just saved them all. A child had flown combat maneuvers that Chen couldn't have imagined attempting. A child whose hands still trembled from the physical strain but who was asking for apple juice because she was 11 years old and 11-year-olds got thirsty. Captain Torres found the PA system. His voice, when he spoke to the passengers, carried the weight of someone who had looked at death and been saved by something he didn't understand. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. The threat has been neutralized. U.S. military fighters destroyed the hostile drones. We are safe. We are continuing to Tokyo where we will land in approximately 2 hours. He paused, struggling with what to say next. We were saved by a military pilot who was on board. I cannot give you more details than that due to security protocols. But everyone on this aircraft owes their life to someone with extraordinary skill and courage. Thank you for your patience during this incident. Flight attendants, please check on all passengers and provide whatever assistance is needed. He released the PA button and turned to Maya, who was standing patiently near the cockpit door, waiting to be dismissed like a student waiting for the teacher's permission to leave class. Maya, I don't know how to thank you. Maya's smile was tired but genuine, and for just a moment she looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, an 11-year-old girl who was exhausted and wanted to sleep. You don't have to thank me, Captain. This is what I trained for. This is why I exist. I'm just glad I was on board. She hesitated, then added with a child's honesty, and I'm glad it worked. It's different when it's real. Simulators don't have the smell. The smell? Fear, sir. In the cabin. During the maneuvers. I could smell everyone's fear through the cockpit door. That's not in the simulators. She left the cockpit before Torres could respond. A flight attendant, not the same one who'd brought her forward, escorted her back to seat 9B, where the elderly Japanese woman immediately grabbed Maya in a fierce hug, crying and speaking rapid Japanese that Maya didn't fully understand but whose emotional content was universal. The businessman in 9A stared at Maya as if she'd grown a second head, his laptop forgotten, his spreadsheets meaningless, his entire worldview shattered by watching a child walk back from the cockpit while F-35s flew escort outside the windows. Maya accepted the hug from the elderly woman, patted her back gently, and then buckled into her seat with movements that were automatic after years of practice. She was asleep within 5 minutes, her body's need for rest overriding everything else. She slept through the remainder of the flight, through the approach into Tokyo, through the landing where emergency vehicles lined the runway just in case. She slept like children sleep, deeply and completely, while around her, adults tried to process what they'd witnessed and failed because their brains had no framework for understanding what Maya represented. When United Flight 738 taxied to the gate at Narita International Airport, it was surrounded by military vehicles, police cars, fire trucks, ambulances, and more media than had ever covered a single civilian flight arrival. News had spread. The story was already going viral: civilian aircraft under attack, unknown hero pilots saving hundreds, conflicting reports about who had actually flown the defensive maneuvers. Maya woke when the flight attendant gently touched her shoulder. "Honey, we've landed. But there are some people who need to talk to you before you deplane." Two men in U.S. military uniforms met Maya at the aircraft door. They were polite, professional, and very clearly there to ensure that Phoenix didn't end up in front of media cameras before proper protocols had been followed. They escorted her through a private corridor while the other passengers deplaned through normal channels, many of them looking for the mysterious pilot who'd saved them, some of them having seen Maya enter the cockpit and trying to understand why military personnel were escorting an 11-year-old in a purple hoodie. The debriefing took 6 hours. Military intelligence officers, aviation safety investigators, and 3 different generals who flew in specifically to speak with Maya. They reviewed every second of the engagement, analyzed her decisions, confirmed that her actions had been within the scope of her training and authority. Project Nightingale's security had been compromised, there was no way to keep it secret after this. The decision was made at levels far above anyone in the room: the program would be declassified. The public would learn that child combat pilots existed. The ethical debate would explode. But 256 people were alive because Maya had been on that flight, and that fact would be the foundation for whatever came next. When they finally released her, when the military escort took her to a hotel where her parents had already flown in to meet her, Maya was so tired she could barely walk. Her mother held her while she cried, not from fear or trauma but from exhaustion and the emotional release that came after combat. Her father sat beside them, tears on his face, holding his daughter's hand and understanding for the first time what the training had really cost her. What it had given her. What it had made her. The press conference happened 3 days later. The world had been waiting, speculation running wild, conspiracy theories exploding across social media, official statements from the U.S. military confirming only that the classified program pilot had saved United Flight 738. The speculation about child soldiers had already started. The outrage was building. The demand for answers was overwhelming. Maya sat at a table in a conference room in Tokyo, wearing her military dress uniform which had been tailored for her small frame. She still looked like a child, because she was one. But the uniform, the ribbons on her chest that represented training completions and flight hours and commendations that most pilots never earned, told a different story. She looked tiny next to the military officials flanking her, 2-star generals who stood like honor guards for this 11-year-old who'd accomplished what they never could. The room was packed with journalists from every major news organization on Earth. Cameras from 36 countries pointed at Maya. The questions started immediately, shouted from multiple directions, but a moderator controlled the chaos, selecting journalists one at a time. The first question came from a CNN reporter, a woman in her 40s whose expression suggested she'd been assigned a story she didn't quite believe yet. "Maya, can you tell us, in your own words, what happened on that flight?" Maya's voice was quiet but clear, carrying the same controlled precision she'd used in the cockpit. The aircraft came under attack by hostile drones. The captain asked if any military pilots were on board. I identified myself and took tactical control. I executed defensive maneuvers while U.S. military fighters engaged the threat. We landed safely. Everyone survived. You're 11 years old. Yes, ma'am. How is that possible? How can an 11-year-old be a military pilot? Maya glanced at the general to her right, who nodded permission to answer. I've been training since I was 6 years old. 5 years of intensive instruction in aviation, tactics, physics, and practical flight experience. I've logged 412 combat hours. Age is a number. Training is what matters. A BBC journalist asked the next question, his British accent sharp with skepticism. Aren't you too young to be a soldier? Isn't this child exploitation? Maya's response was immediate and carried an edge that made several journalists lean forward. I'm not a soldier, sir. I'm a pilot. An exploitation implies someone forced me to do something against my will. Nobody forced me. I was identified as having extraordinary abilities. I was given a choice. My parents were given a choice. We all chose this path. Just like parents choose to send their children to elite sports academies, or music conservatories, or mathematics programs. I'm a specialist, not a soldier. But you flew combat missions. You fought. I saved lives, sir. Today, 256 people are alive because I had the training to do what needed to be done. 42 of those people were children under 12. I counted them during boarding. Would you prefer I hadn't been trained? That those 42 children had died because someone decided I was too young to learn skills that saved their lives? The room fell silent. The question hung in the air with the weight of bodies that would have been scattered across the Pacific Ocean if Maya had been just another 11-year-old coloring pictures instead of a combat pilot. A Japanese journalist asked quietly, "Do you regret losing your childhood?" Maya's expression softened. "Ma'am, I didn't lose my childhood. I chose a different childhood. I still go to school. I still have friends. I still like cartoons and video games and ice cream. But I also know how to fly combat maneuvers that save lives. Both things can be true at the same time. Different doesn't mean wrong." She paused, then added, "And no, I don't regret it. How could I regret being able to save people?" An American military journalist, clearly someone with aviation background based on his questions, asked about the specific maneuvers. Maya answered with technical precision that made the other journalists' eyes glaze over, but that made military pilots watching the live broadcast sit straighter and pay absolute attention. She described G-forces and flight envelopes and tactical decisions using terminology that most adults would need to look up. She explained why she'd flown toward the drones instead of away, why the asymmetric flap deployment had created the radar confusion she needed, why every decision she'd made was the optimal choice given the circumstances. "Where did you learn to think like that?" the journalist asked. "The same place everyone learns complex skills, sir. Through training, practice, repetition, and studying people who are better than me. I've had 5 years of the best instructors in the world teaching me every day. That's more focused training than most pilots get in their entire careers. I'm not special because I'm naturally talented. I'm special because I've had extraordinary instruction and I worked hard to learn what they taught me." The questions continued for 90 minutes. Some journalists were sympathetic, others critical, most simply confused by the cognitive dissonance of an 11-year-old speaking with the authority of a veteran pilot. Maya answered every question with patience and precision, never defensive, never angry, simply stating facts as if they were obvious, and the world's confusion was the surprising part rather than her existence. Near the end, a French journalist asked the question that many had been thinking but hadn't voiced directly. "Are there others like you?" Maya glanced at the general again. He nodded. "Yes. Project Nightingale has graduated 3 classes. I'm in the 3rd class. There are 19 of us currently in active training status, ages 9 to 14. We all volunteered. We're all there because we have specific abilities that make us suited for this kind of work. And we're all hoping we never have to do what I did, but we're prepared if we're needed. Aren't you afraid? Your children flying combat missions." Maya's smile was sad and ancient at the same time. "We're afraid, sir. Being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. It means being afraid and doing it anyway because people's lives depend on us." I was terrified in that cockpit. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing. But 256 people needed me to be more than afraid. So I was. The press conference ended. Maya was escorted out through a private exit while journalists shouted more questions. The story dominated news cycles for weeks. The ethical debate exploded across editorial pages, talk shows, academic journals, and family dinner tables worldwide. Child advocates called it abuse. Military analysts called it necessary. Psychologists warned about developmental damage. Parents of the saved passengers sent letters thanking Maya and saying their children were alive because of her. The F-35 pilots who'd engaged the drones requested a meeting with Maya. It was granted as a photo opportunity, but what happened surprised everyone. The pilots, 5 of them, all combat veterans with multiple deployments, stood at attention when Maya entered the room. The lead pilot, a lieutenant colonel with 22 years of service, actually saluted her. Not perfunctory but full military honors, holding the salute until Maya returned it with practiced precision that looked strange coming from someone who needed a step stool to reach the table where they'd serve refreshments afterward. "Phoenix," the lieutenant colonel said, his voice thick with emotion that military bearing couldn't completely hide. "We watched the telemetry. We reviewed the flight data. Ma'am, what you did in that cockpit, that was flying of the highest order. Half my squadron couldn't have pulled those maneuvers in fighters designed for combat. You did it in a commercial airliner with civilians on board and not one mistake. We came here to say that age doesn't matter in the cockpit. Skill does. And you've got more skill than most pilots we've ever flown with." Another pilot, a woman, a major, with scars on her hands from an ejection that had gone bad, stepped forward. "I've been flying F-35s for 8 years. I've seen combat in 3 different theaters. And I learned something watching you fly. You taught me something about defensive maneuvering that I'd never considered. An 11-year-old taught me how to be a better pilot. That's humbling and inspiring at the same time." She offered her hand. "It's an honor, Phoenix." Maya shook hands with each of them, her small hand disappearing into their larger ones, but the respect in the room was mutual and absolute. These were warriors recognizing a warrior, and age became irrelevant in the face of demonstrated excellence. 6 months later, after the initial media firestorm had diminished to occasional follow-up stories, after the ethical debates had settled into ongoing academic discussions that would last for generations, after the political implications had been absorbed into policy discussions about military training and childhood development, Maya received a commendation that made her the youngest recipient of a military honor in modern American history. The ceremony was public but controlled. Maya wore her uniform, still looking impossibly small on the stage where generals and admirals stood in formation. The Secretary of Defense presented the award, reading from a citation that detailed her actions in clinical military language that somehow failed to capture the impossible nature of what she'd accomplished. When it was Maya's turn to speak, she stepped to the microphone that had been lowered for her height. She looked out at an audience that included the saved passengers of Flight 738, military personnel from 7 different countries, government officials, and her parents sitting in the front row with expressions of pride and sorrow intermingled. "People keep asking if I'm too young," Maya began, her voice carrying through the hall with surprising strength. "They ask if Project Nightingale is ethical. They ask if children should be trained for combat roles. They ask if I lost something precious by choosing this path." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But I notice something about those questions. Nobody ever asks if those 256 passengers were the right age to be saved. Nobody questions if those 42 children under 12 deserved to survive. Nobody says we shouldn't have saved them because the only pilot available was 11 years old." She looked directly at the cameras, speaking now to everyone watching worldwide. When 256 lives need someone who can fly combat, age becomes irrelevant. Training becomes everything. I'm 11 years old. I'm also Phoenix. Both things are true. Both things matter. I have a childhood, it's just different from other kids' childhoods. I go to school, I have friends, I like normal kid things. But I also have skills that saved lives. I don't think I should have to apologize for that. I don't think my parents should regret giving me the opportunity to develop those skills. And I don't think the world should see me as a victim when I chose this path and succeeded at it." She gripped the podium, her knuckles white, emotional now in a way she hadn't been during the press conference. I know I'm young. I know this makes people uncomfortable. I know it challenges assumptions about what children can do and what they should do. But I also know that right now, there's a 10-year-old boy named James who was on Flight 738, sitting in seat 17F with his mom and his little sister. He's alive. His mom is alive. His little sister is alive. They get to grow up together, have holidays together, celebrate birthdays together, because I trained hard for 5 years and was prepared when the impossible happened. Her voice broke slightly. You can call my training child exploitation if you want. You can debate the ethics in universities and newspapers and government hearings. But James and his family? They just call me the reason they're still alive. And that matters more to me than any philosophical argument about whether children should be warriors. She stepped back from the microphone. The applause started slowly, then built, and then became thunderous. Military personnel stood at attention, civilians stood in respect, and in the front row, her parents stood with tears streaming down their faces because their daughter was right and wrong and both at the same time, and that complexity was something the world would have to figure out while Maya continued to be exactly what she'd always been, an extraordinary child who'd made extraordinary choices and lived with extraordinary consequences. Project Nightingale continued operating with modifications. More oversight, more psychological monitoring, more public transparency while maintaining operational security. The children in the program became minor celebrities, though protocols protected their identities and locations. Maya returned to training, to school, to a life that looked normal from the outside except for the weeks when she disappeared for classified exercises that most adults would find terrifying. She turned 12 the next year. Then 13. She grew taller, her skills grew sharper, and the world slowly adjusted to the reality that extraordinary talent existed. In unexpected packages. Other programs started, not military, but identifying gifted children and providing intensive training in their areas of genius. Music prodigies, mathematics savants, athletic phenoms, all following paths that Maya had helped legitimize through her very public demonstration that children, when properly trained and supported, could achieve things that adults assumed impossible. The passengers of Flight 738 held a reunion every year on the anniversary. Maya attended when she could, sitting quietly in corners while adults thanked her with voices that cracked with emotion, while children who'd been on that flight brought their own children years later and said, "This is the person who saved your grandma." She accepted the thanks with grace, but she always felt uncomfortable being treated as extraordinary. She'd just done what she'd been trained to do. Nothing more. On the 10th anniversary of the incident, now 21 years old and a captain in the United States Air Force with over 2,000 combat hours and 3 combat deployments, Maya gave her last major interview about Flight 738. The journalist asked her to reflect on the experience that had defined her public identity. "I think," Maya said carefully, "that the world learned something important that day. Not about me specifically, but about potential. We assume children can't do things because they're children. We protect them, which is good, children should be protected. But sometimes protection becomes limitation. Sometimes we decide children can't handle something not because they actually can't, but because we're uncomfortable with the idea that they might. Do you think more children should be trained for combat roles?" "No," Maya said firmly. "I think we should identify children with extraordinary abilities, whatever those abilities might be, and give them opportunities to develop those abilities appropriately. For some kids, that's music. For others, it's mathematics or athletics or art. For 19 kids across 3 classes, it was aviation and tactical combat. We're not interchangeable. Not every child could do what I did. I couldn't do what a musical prodigy does. But we shouldn't deny opportunity to children who have specific gifts just because those gifts make us uncomfortable. What about the cost? Your childhood." Maya smiled, and at 21, her smile carried the weight of experiences that most people never accumulated in entire lifetimes. "I had a childhood. It was intense, it was demanding, it was different. But I also saved 256 lives when I was 11. I've saved others since then in other situations. I've become someone who makes a difference. Maybe that's worth the cost. Maybe it isn't, I'll probably spend my whole life figuring that out. But I don't regret it. And I hope those 256 people don't regret that I was trained, because the alternative for them was death. The journalist's last question was simple. If you could go back and tell your 6-year-old self something, knowing everything you know now, what would you say? Maya thought for a long moment. Then, I'd tell her that the path she's choosing will be harder than anything she can imagine. That she'll miss things other kids take for granted. That she'll carry weight that children shouldn't have to carry. But I'd also tell her that she'll save lives. That she'll prove something important about human potential. That she'll be Phoenix. And I'd tell her that on a November night over the Pacific Ocean, she'll do something impossible and beautiful and terrifying, and 256 people will live because of choices she makes when she's 11 years old. I'd tell her it's worth it. Every sacrifice, every missed birthday party, every hour of training that left her exhausted, all of it was worth it for those 256 lives. Even knowing the cost. Especially knowing the cost, Maya said. Because now I know what the cost bought. And it bought something precious. The interview ended. The camera crews packed up. Maya left to return to her current assignment, classified, as always, because Phoenix's work was never finished. But that night, before she slept, she thought about Seat 9B on United Flight 738. About being 11 years old with long braids and a purple hoodie with a cartoon character. About the moment when the captain's voice had cracked with terror and desperation. About walking to the cockpit while adults screamed. About the weight of the controls in her small hands. About choosing to be more than fear. She thought about James in Seat 17F, alive now, grown up, maybe with kids of his own who would never know how close they came to not existing because their father almost died when he was 10 years old. She thought about the impossible being possible when training met crisis. She thought about being Phoenix. And she slept peacefully, knowing that whatever the cost, whatever the sacrifice, whatever the debate about ethics and childhood and military training, 256 people were alive because a 6-year-old girl had once chosen an extraordinary path and become exactly what the world needed when everything impossible became necessary. In the end, that was all that mattered. The lives saved justified the childhood transformed. And Phoenix would always choose those lives over the childhood she never had. Every time. Without hesitation. Because that's what Phoenix meant, rising from what should have been ashes and becoming something that saves rather than destroys. An 11-year-old girl in Seat 9B. A warrior in a purple hoodie. A child who saved hundreds. A legend who proved that potential knows no age limit, only the limits we choose to accept or transcend.